The dust kicked up by the stagecoach wheels settled slowly in the afternoon heat as it disappeared down the winding trail toward town. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the wooden platform, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The telegram in her gloved hand was wrinkled from being read and reread during the long journey from Boston. Marriage arrangement confirmed. Arrive Copper Ridge by September 15th. J. Hawthorne. 3 weeks ago, she had been a seamstress in her aunt's shop, stitching wedding dresses for other women's dreams. Now, she was about to become a mail-order bride to a man she'd never met, in a town that looked like it had been carved from the very bones of the earth itself. Before we continue with Sarah's journey into the unknown, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and we love connecting with viewers from all corners of the globe. The main street of Copper Ridge stretched before her like a challenge, lined with weathered buildings that seemed to lean into each other for support. Against the relentless wind, the saloon's at-wing doors swung lazily, releasing bursts of raucous laughter and the tinkling of an off-key piano. Sarah adjusted her navy blue traveling dress and picked up her worn leather suitcase, the only remnant of her father's better days. She had come here out of desperation, not romance. Her aunt's shop had failed, leaving Sarah with nothing but debts and the bitter taste of broken promises. The advertisement in the Boston Herald had seemed like divine intervention. Respectable rancher seeks educated wife for companionship and household management. Serious inquiries only. What she hadn't expected was the man who now approached her with long, measured strides. Jake Hawthorne was nothing like the gentle, bookish gentleman she had imagined. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, and hands that looked like they could break a horse or build a house with equal ease. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at his collar, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds gathering over the prairie. There was something almost predatory in the way he moved, like a wolf circling its territory. When he stopped in front of her, Sarah had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and what she saw there made her stomach flutter with something that wasn't entirely fear. "Miss Mitchell." His voice was rough as sandpaper, carrying the weight of a man who didn't waste words. "I'm Jake Hawthorne." He didn't offer his hand, didn't smile, didn't show any of the courtesy she had expected from a man seeking a wife. Instead, he looked her up and down with the same calculating expression she'd seen him use on the horses in the corral behind him. "You're smaller than I expected." Sarah lifted her chin, drawing on every ounce of dignity her mother had drilled into her during those long-ago etiquette lessons. "I assure you, Mr. Hawthorne, that my size has never prevented me from fulfilling my obligations." The words came out sharper than she intended, but she refused to apologize. She had traveled over 2,000 miles to marry this man, had given up everything she knew for a chance at a new life. The least he could do was show her basic respect. Something flickered in Jake's eyes, gone too quickly for her to identify. "We'll see about that." He reached for her suitcase without asking permission, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, like touching a lightning rod during a storm. "The preacher's waiting at the church. We'll get this done, then I'll show you to the house." Get this done. As if their wedding was nothing more than a business transaction, like buying cattle or negotiating the price of grain. Sarah followed him down the dusty street, her heels clicking against the wooden boardwalk with each determined step. The townspeople they passed stared openly, some with curiosity, others with what looked suspiciously like pity. She caught fragments of whispered conversations. Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. And Jake Hawthorne's finally taking a wife, Lord help her. The church was a simple wooden structure with a bell tower that had seen better days. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and melted candle wax. The preacher, a thin man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, smiled warmly as they approached the altar. "Welcome, welcome. You must be Miss Mitchell. I'm Reverend Thomas. I've known Jake here since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, getting into all sorts of trouble." He chuckled, but Jake's expression remained stone cold. "Let's get on with it, Reverend," Jake said, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "I've got cattle to check before dark." Sarah felt something inside her chest crack like thin ice. This was her wedding day, the moment every girl dreamed about, and her groom was treating it like an inconvenient chore. She thought of her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper back in Boston, and the stories her parents used to tell about their courtship. They had been poor, but they had been in love. What was she doing here, promising to honor and obey a man who looked at her like she was a necessary evil? But it was too late to turn back now. She had no money for a return ticket, no home to go back to, no family who would take her in. This marriage was her only chance at survival, and she would make the best of it, even if it killed her. She stood straighter, folded her hands in front of her, and prepared to become Mrs. Jake Hawthorne. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, devoid of any warmth or romance. Jake's responses were clipped and mechanical, as if he were reciting a grocery list rather than making sacred vows. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, there was an awkward moment where tradition demanded a kiss. Jake hesitated, his jaw tightening, before leaning down to brush his lips against hers in the most perfunctory kiss in the history of matrimony. It lasted less than a second, but Sarah felt the heat of it, all the way down to her toes. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne," Reverend Thomas said, beaming as if he had just witnessed the romance of the century instead of what felt more like a business merger. "May God bless your union with happiness and prosperity." Jake was already turning away, reaching into his vest pocket to pull out a few coins for the Reverend's fee. "Thank you, Reverend. Sarah, we need to go." He didn't wait for her response, just headed for the door with those long strides that forced her to hurry to keep up. The ride to Jake's ranch was conducted in complete silence. Sarah sat rigidly on the wagon seat beside her new husband, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body and the competent way he handled the reins. The landscape around them was breathtaking in its harsh beauty, all rolling hills and endless sky, but she was too nervous to appreciate it properly. Every few minutes, she would steal a glance at Jake's profile, trying to read something, anything in his expression. But his face might as well have been carved from granite for all the emotion it showed. The Hawthorne Ranch, when it finally came into view, was larger and more prosperous looking than she had dared to hope. The main house was a solid 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and real glass windows. There were several outbuildings, including a large barn and what looked like a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Cattle dotted the pastures as far as the eye could see, and she could hear the sound of horses niggering in the corral. Whatever else Jake Hawthorne might be, he was clearly a successful rancher. "This is it," Jake said unnecessarily, as he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. Supper's at 6. Don't be late." He jumped down from the wagon and began unhitching the horses, effectively dismissing her. Sarah climbed down on her own, her legs shaky from the long ride and the emotional upheaval of the day. She retrieved her suitcase from the back of the wagon and made her way up the front steps, each one feeling like a step deeper into an uncertain future. The front door was unlocked, opening into a spacious parlor that was surprisingly well appointed. There were real books on the shelves, a piano in one corner, and furniture that spoke of comfort rather than mere utility. It was a home, not just a house, and for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, Sarah felt a tiny spark of hope. Her room was simple but clean, with a large window that looked out over the rolling pastures. There was a bed with a colorful quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and even a small writing desk. Sarah set her suitcase on the bed and sank into the chair by the window, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she had just done. She was married to a stranger, living in a place that might as well be on the moon for all its resemblance to her old life. And her husband had made it abundantly clear that he wanted nothing from her beyond whatever household duties she could provide. But as she sat there, watching Jake work with the horses in the corral below, something stirred in her chest that she didn't want to examine too closely. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in every gesture, that spoke to a part of her she hadn't known existed. He might not want a wife in the traditional sense, but Sarah Mitchell Hawthorne was nothing if not determined. She had survived her parents' deaths, her aunt's financial ruin, and a journey across half the continent. She could survive this too, and maybe, just maybe, she could build something worthwhile from the ashes of her old dreams. The sun was beginning to set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took her breath away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the name she now carried. Tonight, she would unpack her few belongings, learn the layout of her new home, and begin the long process of figuring out how to live with a man who had married her out of necessity rather than desire. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had, and Sarah had never been one to waste time mourning what couldn't be changed. As the dinner bell rang somewhere below, she smoothed her skirts, checked her reflection in the mirror, and prepared to face her first meal as Mrs. Jake Hawthorne. Whatever happened next, she would meet it with her head held high and her dignity intact. After all, she had already survived the hardest part, hadn't she? The rest was just details. The dining room was as well appointed as the rest of the house, with a long oak table that could easily seat 12 people. Jake was already seated at the head of the table when Sarah entered, his attention focused on the plate of beef and potatoes that had been set before him. He looked up when she appeared, his gaze taking in her appearance with that same calculating expression she was beginning to recognize. She had changed into her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and had taken extra care with her hair. If she was going to be scrutinized, she might as well give him something worth looking at. "Sit," Jake said, gesturing to the chair at his right hand. It wasn't exactly an invitation, more like a command, but Sarah took her place without comment. A woman emerged from what she assumed was the kitchen, carrying a plate identical to Jake's. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "You must be the new Mrs. Hawthorne," the woman said with a warm smile. That was the first genuine welcome Sarah had received since arriving in Copper Ridge. I'm Maria Santos. I keep house for Mr. Jake and do the cooking. Welcome to the ranch. Thank you, Mrs. Santos, Sarah replied, grateful for the woman's friendliness. Everything looks wonderful. Just Maria, please. We don't stand on ceremony here. Maria shot a meaningful look at Jake, who was methodically working his way through his dinner without acknowledging either woman. I hope you'll be happy here, Senora. This house has been too quiet for too long. Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Sarah caught a flash of something that might have been annoyance in his eyes. Maria, don't you have something to do in the kitchen? The older woman's smile didn't waver, but there was steel in her voice when she replied, Of course, Mr. Jake. I'll leave you two to get acquainted. She patted Sarah's shoulder gently before disappearing back through the kitchen door, leaving the newlyweds alone with their awkward silence. Sarah took a bite of the beef, which was perfectly seasoned and tender enough to cut with a fork. This is delicious, she said, hoping to break the tension that seemed to thicken with every passing moment. Maria's a good cook, Jake replied, without looking up from his plate. She'll teach you what you need to know about running the household. The implication was clear. Sarah was expected to take over the domestic duties, to earn her keep through labor rather than companionship. She had expected as much, but hearing it stated so baldly still stung. I'm a quick learner, she said evenly. I managed my aunt's household for 3 years before coming here. Good. Jake finally looked at her, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. There are rules here, Sarah. You'll follow them if you want this arrangement to work. Sarah set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. What kind of rules? You don't go into town alone. You don't interfere with the ranch business. You don't ask questions about my past or my reasons for anything I do. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the terms of their marriage. In return, you'll have a roof over your head, food on your table, and my protection. It's more than most women in your situation could hope for. The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. And what about companionship, conversation, the normal interactions between a husband and wife? Something flickered in Jake's expression, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. This isn't that kind of marriage, Sarah. The sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be for both of us. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, taking in the hard line of his jaw, the way his shoulders seemed to carry some invisible weight. There was pain there, she realized with sudden clarity. Whatever had made Jake Hawthorne into the cold, distant man sitting across from her, it had hurt him deeply. The knowledge didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped her understand it. I see, she said quietly, picking up her fork again. Thank you for being so clear about your expectations. They finished the meal in silence. The only sounds, the clink of silverware against china, and the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. When Jake pushed back from the table, Sarah expected him to excuse himself and disappear into whatever corner of the house he used to avoid human contact. Instead, he surprised her by lingering, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of the table. There's something else, he said finally, his voice rougher than usual, about the sleeping arrangements. Sarah's heart began to pound, though whether from fear or anticipation, she couldn't say. Yes, your room has a lock on the door. Use it. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I won't bother you, Sarah. You have my word on that. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with the remains of their wedding dinner and a dozen questions she was apparently forbidden to ask. Sarah sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her and trying to make sense of the man she had just married. Jake Hawthorne was a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, and she was beginning to suspect that solving him would be the greatest challenge of her life. But as she finally made her way upstairs to her room, Sarah found herself thinking not about the lock on her door, but about the pain she had glimpsed in her husband's eyes. Whatever had broken Jake Hawthorne, it had been thorough and devastating. The question was whether a woman with nothing left to lose could find a way to help him heal, or if she would simply become another casualty of his carefully constructed walls. The days that followed established a routine that was both comfortable and frustrating. Sarah threw herself into learning the intricacies of running the Hawthorne household, working alongside Maria to master everything from preserving vegetables to managing the household accounts. She discovered that Jake's ranch was more prosperous than she had initially realized. With contracts to supply beef to 3 different towns and a growing reputation for breeding quality horses. The man might be emotionally unavailable, but he was undeniably successful. Jake himself remained a distant figure, appearing for meals and disappearing again into the endless work of ranch management. He was unfailingly polite, but never warm, treating her with the same courteous detachment he might show a business associate. Sarah found herself watching him from the kitchen window as he worked with the horses, noting the way his entire demeanor changed when he thought no one was looking. With the animals, he was gentle, patient, even affectionate. It was only with people that he became the cold, unapproachable man she had married. 3 weeks into their marriage, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A group of riders was coming up the main road at a gallop, and even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. Jake emerged from the barn at a run, his face grim as he recognized the lead rider. "Tom!" he called out as the men pulled their horses to a stop in a cloud of dust. "What's happened?" Tom Bradley, Jake's foreman, was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked the ranch for over a decade. Sarah had met him briefly and found him to be respectful but reserved, clearly devoted to his boss. Now, his face was pale beneath his tan, and his hands shook as he dismounted. "It's the Comanche, Jake," Tom said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "They hit the Morrison place last night, burned them out, took their horses and cattle. John Morrison's dead, and his wife and daughter are missing." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard stories about Indian raids, of course, but they had seemed like something from another time, not a present danger. The Morrison Ranch was only 15 miles away, close enough that the smoke from their burning buildings might have been visible if the wind had been right. Jake's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "How many were there?" "Hard to say. Maybe 20, maybe more. They knew what they were doing, Jake. This wasn't some random raid by young bucks looking for glory. This was planned, organized." Tom's voice dropped lower, but Sarah could still hear every word. "There's talk in town about forming a militia going after them." "That's a fool's errand, and you know it," Jake replied sharply. "Chasing Comanche across open country is a good way to get more people killed. We need to focus on protecting what's ours." As the men continued their discussion, Sarah became aware of a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the immediate threat. She had noticed Jake's reaction to the news, the way his entire body had gone rigid with tension that seemed to go beyond normal concern for neighbors. There was something personal in his response, something that spoke to old wounds and buried fears. That evening, Jake appeared at dinner, armed with a rifle and wearing a gun belt she had never seen before. His face was set in lines of grim determination, and he ate his meal with the mechanical efficiency of a man preparing for battle. Sarah waited until Maria had cleared the dishes before speaking. "You're expecting them to come here," she said. It wasn't a question. Jake looked up from cleaning his rifle, his gray eyes meeting hers directly for the first time in days. "It's possible. The Hawthorne Ranch is one of the largest in the territory. We have good horses, plenty of cattle, and we're isolated enough that help wouldn't arrive quickly." "What can I do to help?" The question seemed to surprise him. He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was serious. "You can stay in the house and keep out of the way if trouble comes." Sarah felt a familiar spark of irritation at his dismissive tone. "I'm not helpless, Jake. I can shoot, and I'm not afraid of hard work or danger. If this ranch is under threat, then I want to help defend it." "You can shoot?" There was skepticism in his voice, but also something that might have been interest. "My father taught me when I was 12. He said a woman living on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself." Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. "I may not be the wife you wanted, but I'm the wife you have, and I don't intend to cower in a corner while other people fight for my home." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "This is your home?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had been thinking of the ranch as home for weeks now, but hearing Jake ask about it made her realize how much the place had come to mean to her. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the rifle, but his attention focused entirely on her face. "All right," he said finally. "Tomorrow I'll teach you to use this rifle properly, but if trouble comes, you follow my orders without question. Understood?" "Understood." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that carried the scent of coming winter. Jake led Sarah to a clearing behind the barn, where he had set up targets made from old tin cans and pieces of wood. The rifle he handed her was heavier than the one her father had taught her with, but the basic principles were the same. "Show me what you know," Jake said, stepping back to give her room. Sarah raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the prairie, and one of the tin cans went spinning off its perch. She worked the lever action smoothly and fired again, hitting a second target dead center. When she lowered the rifle, Jake was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Where did you say you learned to shoot?" "My father taught me. He was a soldier before he married my mother." Sarah handed the rifle back to him, pleased to see approval in his eyes for the first time since their wedding. He said that in a dangerous world, the ability to defend yourself was the most valuable skill anyone could have. "Your father was a wise man." Jake took the rifle and checked the action with practiced ease. But there's a difference between target shooting and shooting to kill. When you're facing a man who wants to hurt you, everything changes. Your hands shake, your heart pounds, and you have maybe one chance to get it right. "Have you ever had to kill a man, Jake?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it, and she immediately regretted it when she saw Jake's face close off again. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would retreat behind his wall of silence and leave her wondering. "Yes," he said finally, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. More than once. There was pain in those words, old and deep and carefully buried. Sarah wanted to ask more, to understand what had shaped this complex, damaged man she had married. But she could see that he had already revealed more than he intended, and pushing now would only drive him further away. "I'm sorry," she said instead. "That must have been terrible." Jake looked at her sharply, as if surprised by her sympathy rather than her curiosity. "It was necessary," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. They spent the next hour working on her shooting technique, with Jake offering quiet corrections and occasional words of praise. Sarah found herself studying his face when he wasn't looking, noting the way his features softened slightly when he was focused on teaching rather than maintaining his emotional distance. There was a good man buried beneath all that pain and anger. She was becoming more certain of it with each passing day. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. "Jake, I want you to know that whatever happened to you before we married, it doesn't change anything between us. I'm your wife, and I'm here to stay." Jake stopped walking so abruptly that Sarah took several more steps before realizing he was no longer beside her. When she turned back, he was staring at her with an expression of such raw vulnerability that it took her breath away. "You don't know what you're saying, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't know what I've done, what I'm capable of." "Then tell me," she said, taking a step toward him. "Help me understand." For a moment, she thought he might actually do it. His mouth opened as if he were about to speak, and she could see the war being fought behind his eyes. But then the shutters came down again, and he shook his head. "Some things are better left buried," he said, and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the prairie wind with more questions than ever. That night, Sarah lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her and thinking about the man sleeping somewhere down the hall. She had married Jake Hawthorne, expecting nothing more than security and a roof over her head. She certainly hadn't expected to find herself falling in love with a man who seemed determined to keep her at arm's length. But there was no denying the way her heart raced when he looked at her, or the way she found herself watching for him throughout the day. The question was, what to do about it? Jake had made it clear that he didn't want a real marriage, that he saw her as nothing more than a housekeeper with legal standing. But Sarah had seen the cracks in his armor, the moments when his carefully constructed walls came down just enough to reveal the man beneath. There was something worth fighting for there, if she could find the courage to try. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah made herself a promise. She would find a way to reach Jake Hawthorne, to break through the barriers he had built around his heart. It might take months or even years, but she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. And sometimes the most worthwhile battles were the ones that seemed impossible to win. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn, when the world was caught between darkness and light. Sarah woke to the sound of gunfire and shouting, her heart immediately racing as she remembered Jake's warnings. She threw on her robe and grabbed the rifle he had given her, her hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. From her bedroom window, she could see dark figures moving through the ranch yard, some on horseback and others on foot. The barn was already burning, orange flames licking at the wooden structure and sending sparks dancing into the pre-dawn sky. She could hear Jake's voice shouting orders to his men, though she couldn't make out the words over the chaos of battle. Sarah made her way downstairs as quietly as possible, staying low and keeping away from the windows. The front door was barricaded with furniture, and she could see the barrel of a rifle poking through a gap in the boards. Someone was already defending the house. Probably Maria or one of the ranch hands. "Sarah!" Jake's voice came from somewhere near the kitchen, and she followed the sound to find him crouched behind an overturned table, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "What are you doing down here? I told you to stay upstairs." "The upstairs isn't any safer than down here," Sarah replied, settling beside him with her rifle ready. "Besides, you need all the help you can get." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but another volley of gunfire from outside cut off whatever he had been about to say. "There are at least 15 of them," he said instead, checking his ammunition with practiced efficiency. "They've got us surrounded, but they haven't tried to rush the house yet. I think they're waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" "I don't know, and that's what worries me." Jake peered around the edge of the table, his face grim in the flickering light from the burning barn. This isn't how Comanche usually fight. They hit hard and fast, take what they can, and disappear. This feels different. As if summoned by his words, a voice called out from the yard, speaking English with only a slight accent. "Jake Hawthorne, we know you're in there. Come out and face us like a man." Sarah saw Jake's entire body go rigid, his face draining of color, as if he had seen a ghost. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "It can't be." "Jake, what is it? Who is that?" But Jake wasn't listening to her anymore. He was staring at the barricaded door with an expression of such horror and guilt that Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Whatever was happening here, it was about more than a simple raid. This was personal. "Jake Hawthorne," the voice called again, closer now. "You cannot hide from your past forever. Come out and pay for what you have done." Sarah watched as Jake closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging, as if under an enormous weight. When he opened them again, there was a resignation there that frightened her more than all the gunfire and burning buildings combined. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever happens next, whatever you hear or see, I want you to know that marrying you was the best thing I've done in a very long time." "Jake, you're scaring me. What's going on?" He reached out and touched her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek with infinite tenderness. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning, about who I am, what I've done. But I was a coward, and now it's too late." "It's not too late for anything," Sarah said fiercely, catching his hand and holding it against her cheek. "Whatever this is about, we'll face it together. That's what married people do." Jake's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "You still don't understand, do you? I'm not the man you think I am, Sarah. I'm not even the man I pretended to be." He pulled his hand away and stood up, his rifle held loosely at his side. "My name isn't Jake Hawthorne, it's Jacob Hawthorne Mitchell, and 5 years ago, I was a captain in the United States Army." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Mitchell, her maiden name. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I was stationed at Fort Richardson, tasked with keeping the peace between the settlers and the Comanche. But I was young and arrogant, convinced that I knew better than my commanding officers." Jake's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were reciting someone else's story. "There was a Comanche village about 30 miles from the fort, peaceful people who had never caused any trouble. But there were rumors that they were harboring raiders, and I decided to investigate." Sarah felt sick to her stomach, already knowing where this story was heading. "Jake, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He looked at her with eyes full of pain and regret. "I took 20 men and rode to that village, intending to search for evidence of raiding. But when we got there, the chief refused to let us enter. He said it would violate the treaty his people had signed with the government. I should have respected that, should have returned to the fort and reported to my superiors. But you didn't. No, I didn't. I was angry, frustrated, convinced that they were hiding something. So I ordered my men to search the village anyway. Jake's voice broke slightly, and Sarah could see the weight of his guilt crushing down on him. There was a struggle. Someone fired a shot. I don't even know who. And then everything went to hell. The voice outside called again, closer now and filled with rage. Jacob Mitchell, come out and face the families of those you murdered. Sarah felt the world tilt around her as the full horror of the situation became clear. "Oh, Jake," she whispered. When the smoke cleared, 17 people were dead. Men, women, children. Innocent people who had done nothing wrong except refuse to let soldiers ransack their homes. Jake's hands were shaking now, the rifle trembling in his grip. I tried to cover it up, to make it look like they had attacked us first. But the truth came out eventually. I was court-martialed, stripped of my rank, and dishonorably discharged. I should have been hanged. But you weren't. No, I had friends in high places, people who believed my version of events. So instead of a noose, I got exile. I changed my name, came west, and tried to build a new life. But you can't outrun the past, Sarah. It always catches up with you eventually. The sound of breaking glass came from the front of the house, followed by shouts and the crash of furniture being overturned. The attackers were inside now, and there was nowhere left to run. "Sarah," Jake said urgently, pressing a small derringer into her hands, "there's a root cellar behind the pantry. Hide there and don't come out no matter what you hear. Promise me." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah said fiercely. "We're in this together, remember? This isn't your fight. These people have a right to their revenge, but you're innocent. You don't deserve to pay for my crimes." Sarah looked at the man she had married, seeing him clearly, for perhaps the first time. Yes, he had done terrible things, made choices that had cost innocent lives, but she could also see the guilt and remorse that had been eating at him for 5 years, the way his crimes had already punished him more thoroughly than any court ever could. "Maybe I don't deserve to pay for your crimes," she said quietly, "but I choose to stand with my husband, whatever the cost." Jake stared at her in amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Sarah, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." She raised the rifle, checking the action the way he had taught her. "You made a terrible mistake 5 years ago, and you've been trying to atone for it ever since. That doesn't make you a monster, Jake. It makes you human." Before Jake could respond, the kitchen door burst open and 3 Comanche warriors entered, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. The leader was a man in his 40s, with graying hair and eyes that burned with righteous fury. When he saw Jake, his lips pulled back in a snarl of hatred. "Jacob Mitchell," he said in accented English, "at last we meet again." Jake stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the warriors. "Running Bear, I wondered if you had survived." "I survived to see justice done. My wife, my daughter, my grandson, they all died because of your arrogance and hatred." Running Bear's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the pain beneath the anger. "For 5 years, I have searched for you. For 5 years, I have dreamed of this moment." "I know," Jake said quietly, "and I'm sorry. I know that doesn't bring them back, doesn't undo what I did, but I am truly, deeply sorry." "Sorry?" Running Bear laughed bitterly. "You think your sorrow means anything to me? You think it will bring back the innocent blood you spilled?" "No," Jake replied. "Nothing can do that. But I want you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought about what I did, haven't wished I could change it." Sarah watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about revenge, she realized. This was about justice, about a father and grandfather seeking closure for an unimaginable loss. And Jake, for all his faults, was prepared to face the consequences of his actions. "You will come with us," Running Bear said. "You will face the families of those you killed, and they will decide your fate." "I'll come," Jake said without hesitation. "But the woman stays here. She had nothing to do with what happened at your village." Running Bear's gaze shifted to Sarah, taking in her defensive posture and the rifle in her hands. "She is your woman? She's my wife. Then she shares your guilt." "No." Jake's voice was sharp with authority, the tone of a man accustomed to command. "She married me 3 weeks ago. She doesn't even know my real name until tonight. If you want justice, take me, but leave her out of this." Sarah felt something break open in her chest at Jake's words. Even now, facing his own death, he was trying to protect her. It was the act of a good man, whatever mistakes he might have made in the past. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, stepping up beside Jake despite his attempt to shield her. "If you take my husband, you take me too." Running Bear studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "You would die for this man, even knowing what he has done?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "I would." "Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer was anything but simple. Sarah thought about the past 3 weeks, about the glimpses she had caught of the man beneath Jake's carefully constructed armor. She thought about his gentleness with the horses, his protection of her, the way he had tried to shield her from his past, even at the cost of emotional intimacy. "Because he's a good man who made a terrible mistake," she said finally. "Because he spent 5 years trying to atone for what he did. And because I love him." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah saw Jake's head turn sharply toward her, his eyes wide with shock. She hadn't meant to say it, hadn't even fully admitted to herself until this moment. But now that the words were out, she knew they were true. Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Sarah and Jake, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You love him," he said finally. "Even knowing what he is?" Sarah corrected. "The man who made a mistake and has been trying to make amends ever since. A man who was willing to die to protect me from the consequences of his past." "Sarah," Jake said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." She turned to face him fully, letting him see the truth in her eyes. "I love you, Jacob Mitchell. Not the man you pretended to be, but the man you really are. The man who has been carrying this guilt for 5 years, who built this ranch with his own hands, who treats his animals with kindness and his employees with respect." Jake stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "How can you love me? I'm a killer, Sarah. I have innocent blood on my hands. And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since." Sarah reached out and took his hand, not caring that they had an audience of armed warriors. "That guilt, that remorse, it proves that you're not the monster you think you are. A real monster wouldn't care about the lives he had taken." Running Bear made a sound that might have been surprise or disgust. "You speak of love and redemption, white woman. But what of justice? What of the families who still mourn their dead?" Sarah turned back to the Comanche leader, her chin raised defiantly. "What kind of justice are you looking for? Will killing my husband bring back your family? Will it ease your pain or just create more? It will satisfy the debt of blood that he owes. Will it?" Sarah challenged. "Or will it just make you a killer too?" The words seemed to hit Running Bear like a physical blow. His face darkened with anger, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might strike her down where she stood. But then something shifted in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that gave her hope. "You think you understand our ways, white woman? You think your words can wash away the blood of innocence? I think that revenge and justice aren't the same thing," Sarah said, carefully. "I think that killing my husband won't bring you peace. It will just add to the cycle of violence that has already cost too many lives." "Then what would you have me do? Let him go free while my family lies in the ground?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words might determine whether she and Jake lived or died. "I would have you let him live to make amends. Let him use his life to help others, to try to balance the scales of what he's done. Dead, he's just another casualty. Alive, he might be able to do some good in the world." Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Sarah and Jake as if weighing their souls. Finally, he spoke to Jake directly. "What say you, Jacob Mitchell? Do you accept this woman's words as your own?" Jake looked at Sarah with an expression of wonder and gratitude that took her breath away. "I accept whatever fate you choose for me, Running Bear. But I want you to know that she's right. I have spent every day of the last 5 years trying to find a way to atone for what I did. If you let me live, I swear to you that I will continue that effort until my dying day." "And how would you do this? How would you make amends for the lives you took?" Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking carefully about his answer. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'm willing to spend the rest of my life finding out. Maybe I could help other people, protect them from the kind of violence I once brought to your village. Maybe I could use my ranch to provide for families who have lost their providers. I don't know what form it would take, but I swear to you that I would try." Running Bear studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in his eyes. "You would do this? You would dedicate your life to helping others?" "Yes," Jake said, without hesitation. "I would." "And you, white woman, you would help him in this task?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment, the knowledge that her answer might determine not just their fate, but the fate of countless others who might benefit from Jake's efforts at redemption. "Yes," she said firmly, "I would." Running Bear was quiet for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes moving between them as if weighing their very souls. Finally, he lowered his weapon and spoke to his companions in their own language. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the authority in his tone. "You will live, Jacob Mitchell," Running Bear said finally, "but not because I forgive you. I will never forgive you for what you took from me. You will live because this woman has convinced me that your death would serve no purpose beyond satisfying my own desire for revenge." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief, but Running Bear wasn't finished. "But know this," he continued, his voice hard as granite. "If I ever hear that you have failed in your promise, if I learn that you have returned to your old ways or forgotten the debt you owe, I will come for you again. And next time, no words will save you." "I understand," Jake said quietly, "and I give you my word that you will never have cause to regret this decision." Running Bear nodded curtly, then turned to his companions and spoke again in Comanche. The 3 warriors filed out of the kitchen as silently as they had entered, leaving Sarah and Jake alone with the wreckage of their home and the weight of their new understanding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah could hear the sound of horses departing, the crackle of flames from the burning barn, and the distant voices of the ranch hands assessing the damage. But all of that seemed secondary to the man standing beside her, the husband she had just saved, and who had in turn saved her from a life of loneliness and regret. "Sarah," Jake said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "what you did back there, what you said—" "I meant every word," Sarah interrupted, turning to face him fully. "I love you, Jake. Jacob, whoever you are, whatever you've done, I love you." Jake stared at her for a moment, then pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness and self-imposed isolation. "I don't deserve you," he whispered against her hair. "I don't deserve your love or your forgiveness." "That's not your decision to make," Sarah said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "Love isn't about deserving, Jake. It's about choosing. And I choose you." Jake's response was to kiss her. Not the perfunctory brush of lips they had shared at their wedding, but a real kiss, full of passion and promise and the desperate gratitude of a man who had been given a second chance at life. Sarah melted into his embrace, feeling as if all the pieces of her world were finally falling into place. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Jake's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you too," he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stood up to me at dinner that first night. But I was too much of a coward to admit it, even to myself." "We're both here now," Sarah said, reaching up to touch his face gently. "That's all that matters." Jake caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek, his eyes closing, as if he were memorizing the feel of her touch. "I meant what I told Running Bear," he said, "about spending my life trying to make amends. Will you really help me with that?" "Of course I will. We're partners now, in every sense of the word." Jake opened his eyes and smiled at her, the first real smile she had seen from him since their wedding day. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more hopeful than she had ever imagined possible. "Partners," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I like the sound of that." As the sun began to rise over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah and Jake stood together in the ruins of their kitchen and began to plan their future. There would be challenges ahead, she knew. The ranch would need to be rebuilt. Their marriage would need to be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and trust, and Jake would need to find a way to live with his past while working toward a better future. But for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, Sarah felt truly hopeful. She had found love in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely man, and together they would build something beautiful from the ashes of their old lives. The vows they had spoken in that little church had been empty words at the time, a legal formality that bound them together without any real meaning. But now, standing in the wreckage of their home, with their arms around each other and their hearts finally open, Sarah knew that they were making new vows, vows of love and partnership, of forgiveness and redemption, of a shared commitment to building a life worthy of the second chance they had been given. Jake Hawthorne had married her out of necessity, not desire. But Jacob Mitchell loved her with a passion that would last forever. And that, Sarah thought as she kissed her husband in the golden light of dawn, made all the difference in the world.